I wish all politicians, Democrat and Republicans, would recognize the importance that we're made in God's image and that we need to protect life, because I think it has such downstream impact for people and for the culture that if we were more pro-life as a country, many, many things would flow from that. And so what does God want us to do as his believers in this environment, in this particular area, the sphere of influence? What does he want from us? And we'll discuss it today with John and Tim. Let's start with this basic question, and I'm looking forward to the discussion because, a lot of Christians do pull back, and we'll get into that, but we know as Americans it's important to vote. Why is it harder to convince Christians about engaging and the importance of voting maybe than ever before? There's such division. John, let's start with you.
Well, I think there's a little bit of a worldview problem that American Christians often have.
And what's that problem?
Well, it's just separating the secular from the sacred, separating that, my Christianity has something to do with part of life, but maybe not all of life, that it really shapes my personal moral decisions, how I schedule my Sundays and, maybe a few other volunteer days throughout the week, but it really doesn't, go beyond personal morality. But that's a different message than the historic understanding of Christianity, certainly than what the Bible talks about, that God's the creator of everything and Jesus Christ is Lord of heaven and earth. And of course, Paul's epistles talk about our civic life. It talks about our family life. It talks about our community life. It talks about our roles as parents and everything else. So there's not a square inch, as my favorite theologian used to say, Abraham Kuyper and Chuck Colson repeating him, over which Christ isn't Lord. And that does count politics. So I think we have to think holistically about our faith. I think that's one aspect of it.
No, that's good. It's good framework. Tim, you're in this. You've been working in politics for the last 40 years. And it's such a great privilege for Focus to have you on the staff. But you have one of the best Rolodexes in the country, in my opinion. But in that regard, you do inform me about how the staff of both Democrat and Republican legislatures tend to talk together, maybe have lunch together occasionally, what have you. And you've got many of those relationships. Describe that environment that we're never going to see on cable news, that you do pick up the phone and call people that have a different persuasion, and you exchange ideas.
Well, let me just say to that point, in my nearly 40 years here in Washington, I am unaware, Jim and John, of as many Bible studies as ever that are taking place in the U.S. Senate, in the House, and in many of the cabinet agencies of the federal government. So I think that the relationships between Democrats and Republicans, where it's popular to say that it's always acidic and we're always at each other's throats, is very often, not always, overstated. But I do have to say this. I do have to say, to your central point, the polarization is a hyper-polarization. And I think that it's driven by a number of factors. But when Christians, and I think it's very easy for everyone to be discouraged and despairing, in an environment like this, when Christians simply throw up our hands and say, I've had it, I'm not going to be involved, we're actually going against the grain of what we are taught in Scripture. And I think, it's very important to say in this critically important election year that's a bad decision, and it's very deep water.
It's kind of interesting. I hadn't thought about it in an election process, but Paul, as he's persecuted and thrown in jail, pulls out the citizen card. Hey, what are you doing? Do you know I'm a Roman citizen and you're beating me? Don't I get a fair trial? He kind of pulled out that citizen card in that context. And in many ways, the similarities might end there, but the idea that we engage. We have the right to vote. And I think, one of the things, the stories that perhaps that was not written about the most recent elections is the way the Christian voting bloc, it's not uniform. There's liberal Christian viewpoints and conservative Christian viewpoints, and I recognize that. So we're not speaking on behalf of this, singularity of voting. But the Christian vote tends to be more conservative. And I want to get into that a little bit with respect to kind of the chiding that occurs by the media. I mean, I've had many background conversations, Tim, John, I'm sure you have. New York Times will call and do background saying, how can conservatives support this candidate because morally they don't hit the notes that typically the Christian community would want to see. And I thought that was one of the great misses. I think the Christian community finally realized, okay, we're not voting in a pastor. Speak to that, the nature of that in regards to, I don't know if that's a maturing of that voter bloc or a dampening down of those things, because the culture, to your point earlier, is becoming so polarized that the vicious attacks that occur on both sides and the extreme left and the extreme right seem to be getting all of the media attention. So those in the, that big middle that want to be diplomatic, want to talk through what is best for the country, come to a rational, reasonable conclusion about policy, we just don't seem to have a voice there.
Look, I think the polarization point explains a lot of this. And that's because it's one thing to live in a culture where we agree on where we're trying to get to, but maybe disagree on how we're going about it. And that's kind of been the history, I think, of our nation, where we've had kind of a common sense of identity and a common sense of values. That's less the case than it used to be, I guess, is a diplomatic way of saying it. We now live in a culture in which we don't agree where we're trying to get to. And so the issues that we end up voting on that become political issues are first and foremost moral concerns. Who counts as one of us, as members of the human race? Where do we get our value and dignity as individuals? What is the significance of marriage and family? How do we understand the family? And how much should we enable kind of personal freedom at the expense of those that are the weakest or most vulnerable among us, particularly children? I've just kind of hit the domestic issues, as the grounding of our understanding, but think of the implications there for things like education and things like conscience rights and so on. These are really important issues that we are distinguishing between.
It's almost like, though, they shame the Christian conservative community into not supporting a more liberal perspective, including abortion. And some conservative writers have come out, saying, I would put abortion aside for the sake of the moral character of the candidates. And I'm thinking to myself, I would never sacrifice a child for that. Virtue, what is virtue? Because a candidate represents themselves better than another candidate, I'm going to look for the candidate that says, hey, I want to defend the voiceless. I want to defend the preborn. That's what I'm going to look for. And I don't care if that person's a Democrat or Republican. I remember meeting with Dan Lipinski, a pro-life Democrat, and we had 3 or 4 meetings together, and I really appreciated and reinforced for him that we're in your corner. He's no longer in the Congress because he was primaried out by Planned Parenthood. Frankly, they spent $4 million in the primary to remove him and put a more pro-abortion Democrat in that place. But man, God bless that man for the convictions that he had. That's where I feel like where I'm at. I am never going to give up a child's life for the sake of a candidate who's kind and gentle and treats people with tolerance. I mean, that's not the scale for me. I want somebody who will fight for that preborn child and that mom. Am I getting it right?
Well, that's where a Christian worldview has to come in. We don't think that all issues are morally equal. We think that there are some issues that have greater moral weight than the others. And we think that if you don't get those issues right, you're more likely to get the rest of them wrong as well. And I think that obviously the definition and value and dignity of human life has to be first and foremost.
Yeah.
And if we're really doing a reading of the political moment that we're in, we're not in the 90s days of safe, legal, and rare anymore. The parties have shifted dramatically on this issue.
Yeah.
The parties have shifted dramatically on how to best protect children through the institution of the family and what that means, the role of the state in the lives and well-being of children. I mean, listen, we have political things that we are considering right now that will introduce the government in between parents and their children. Mm-hmm. That's a real problem.
Tim, let me turn your way. You live in Virginia with your wife. Your 2 sons now are on their way professionally and doing their own thing. And in Virginia, it was quite an insight about parental rights. I mean, that's when Governor Youngkin won the governorship of Virginia. And basically, he ran pretty aggressively on the strife that had occurred at school board meetings and some of the gender stuff that was being attempted and bathroom use and all those kinds of things that threw both Democrat and Republican parents into a tizzy. And I think rightfully so, to defend children in the school environment. Speak to that idea of parental rights. There are several movements all focused on that to try to alert the culture that, hey, schools do not own our children. We do as their parents. This is a big issue, both for Democrats and Republicans.
The election in the Commonwealth of Virginia was a culture election. And in fact, I would argue, Jim, that Governor Youngkin, as a candidate, was losing before, in a very unpredictable way, a former governor who wanted to come back into office said essentially parents ought to butt out of discussions of school curriculum and matters of school. And it was at that moment that Governor Youngkin said just the opposite, that parental rights were central, that schools and the state do not parent our children, but that parents parent our children. And it was that single issue that catalyzed him into the governor's office. And I think it underscores, and I love the narrative of this program, because it underscores the fact that Christ, not politics, is our hope. He's called us to engage and to discern and, to the best of our abilities, uphold good and lesser evil. And it seems to me that the first duty of Christian citizenship is to vote, and sometimes to have to apply a very pragmatic sense of it. You know, the focus on the family office here in Washington, D.C. is right across the street from the Supreme Court. And so I am reminded every single day that when you go to the polls as a Christian, and it's a federal presidential election year, you are not just electing a president and a vice president. You are electing a president, a vice president, more than 3,000 political appointees who will come with them and their worldview to office. And the reason I mentioned the Supreme Court is because you have the constitutional obligation and duty to nominate and see confirmed Supreme Court justices and federal justices and judges at every level. Donald Trump, president for 4 years, more than 200 federal judges and 3 Supreme Court nominees in a mere 4 years. President Biden, 4 years in office, more than 200 federal judges and 1 Supreme Court justice. So elections matter, and there is a practical application of why Christians should vote.
Yeah. And, you know, again, I look at that issue of parental rights kind of with the abortion issue, for example. Think of those things. So some conservative writers, New York Times writer David French, you know, basically saying when we're looking at candidate selection, you know, maybe you hold your nose and vote for somebody more, you know, kinder, gentler kind of thing, yet they're not supporting life. Fill in the blank for whatever the issue is, whether it's the issue of abortion, the issue of parental rights, religious freedom. At what point do we get bullied into staying home and not voting because, you know, in some way we're ashamed? And that just doesn't make sense to me, John. I don't know.
No, Tim's put us absolutely on the right track, which is the framework of advancing good and lessening evil. That's the framework
now,
we've got to bring.
Isn't that the biblical declaration of what government is supposed to do as a mandate from God is to restrain evil?
It is, and it's a little bit different than how we usually talk about it, which is the lesser of two evils. You know, if we were voting between two kings, that might make a little bit more sense. All we would think about is the personality and the tone and that sort of thing of the people that are actually running. But we're talking about policy. We're talking about the worldview, as Tim said, of 3,000 non-elected officials that come along with a president. and have an awful lot of influence and power. If you think about the issues we've already talked about, life and the definition of family, who's run HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services? Who runs the Department of Education? Who runs the Department of Justice? These are positions that have incredible downstream impact on our everyday lives and on our neighbors. And of course, that's the greatest commandment, is to love God and then to love our neighbors. Tim, I think, did a great job pointing us to the state level, and I would point us even beyond that to the local level and to the school boards. I mean, you know, the conversation of who was in the Loudoun County School Board led to who's going to be the governor of Virginia, and has created a nationwide conversation.
That's so true. And I think the issue here, if we think about those 25 to as high as 40 million, it's been reported, of Christians who do not vote, what we're trying to do is convince you to go vote. Yeah. I mean, that's part of that responsibility. And we're not telling you who to vote for. We're just saying there are things on the line that are critically important. And read the Word. I mean, we'll even help point you to scriptures that will support those positions that Focus has taken. We don't do this willy-nilly. We're trying to give a cogent biblical perspective on why we support life, why we support parental rights, why we support a healthy two-parent family and the benefits of that, why we support getting government's budgets under control so less of our taxpayer money goes to paying interest and can do programs. Tim, let me ask you, with regards to physical safety, I mean, this comes back to the schools and what's happening. We've got a good friend, Dr. Mark Yarhouse. He, I believe, is still on the American Psychological Association panel on gender dysphoria. But you look at that data generally, about 85% of sexually confused preteens and teens, gender dysphoric teens and preteens, 85% will self-correct by 19. And this is kind of the moral problem that we face as believers. Who is fighting for those children, even though they don't even know what they're doing right now? And I've been able to interview 3 or 4 detransitioners, as they're called, people in their teens or preteens begin the hormone treatments or even medical treatment to change to the other gender. And of course, there's psychological issues connected to this, and we realize that. But that simple data point that 85% of these young people will self-correct if you leave them alone. And the way now that the politics are playing into this, that they are mutilating these children into a lifelong battle, it's morally repugnant. And that's a battle line that's occurring in these elections as well. Those that want to knock down every barrier for a school to help that child into a transition situation, to do double mastectomies, hysterectomies on 13, 14, 15-year-old girls. I mean, it is horrible. And we're the adults saying, no, it's not going to happen under our watch. I don't care who you vote for. That simply should not be occurring with those kids.
I think this goes back to my comment about the power of the unseen bureaucracy. Every day at 9 o'clock in the morning, geysers of bureaucrats go into their positions in the federal cabinet agencies. And every day around 4 o'clock, geysers of bureaucrats come out. And Congress, by and large, does not legislate the kind of policies, Jim, that you are articulating so beautifully. It is the bureaucrats who take an enormous license and begin to fashion and create what becomes federal policy in these matters. And so, to John's wonderful point, to who is the cabinet secretary and how does that cabinet secretary get into that position? It's through what we call politics and policy. And it's why I think it's important that we raise on a program like this that we call it politics, but at the end of the day, politics is really a fancy word for a branch of ethics. And we pour into part of our politics a worldview. Our common and great late friend Chuck Colson famously said that salvation will never arrive on Air Force One. And so it's very important that we Christians always distinguish God and government. But as St. Paul said so beautifully, in that incredible letter to the church at Rome, he said, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority, and I want to repeat this if I may. Paul says there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. And what does he mean there? With that statement, Paul defines this very important relationship, it seems to me, between Christians and government.
Yeah, so well said, John.
I think it's very important then to point out, and Tim has actually written very well about this, the authority that God has instituted in our context is the citizen. We traded in, if you remember that line from the movie The Patriot, the king 1,000 miles away for 1,000 kings 1 mile away. And there's an enormous amount of authority how to think about our lives together given to everyday citizens. And that is enabled simply by voting. Yeah. And Paul says also, if you can do some good, you should do it. And if you don't do that good, it's sin.
Yeah.
Now, we can talk about the limits of what our vote can actually deliver, but it can deliver some good. And the topic you were talking about in particular, about this gender confusion that has swept over the United States. And we look around the world, and a lot of countries are backpedaling like crazy.
Yeah, because they're going by the science.
They're going by the science, and we currently are not. And there are particular bureaucrats, not only on the federal level, but also on the state level, which is why the down ticket is so important in this particular election, that aren't just removing all barriers to kids making decisions. They want to enable government officials hand-holding and walking kids down into this confusion while getting parents out of the way.
Yeah.
And the same thing applies to the abortion issue, that, we're not just talking about kind of a neutrality. In the state of Colorado, we have an amendment, Amendment 79. If it goes through, what it would do would essentially enshrine abortion without any restrictions in terms of process or term, third term, late term abortion in the Constitution. It would actually increase dramatically taxpayer funding for abortion services on the local level, and it removes parental notification, all of which lays the groundwork for being able to attack pro-life healthcare professionals, including pro-life pregnancy centers. Mm-hmm. This is a remarkable move way beyond the safe, legal, and rare, which we were in the 90s.
Yeah, that's in the rearview mirror.
Oh, yeah, and it's happening on a state level. This isn't a neutral issue. This isn't just a, how will my abortion affect you sort of neutrality that we hear in the media. Yeah. And it's Colorado, it's Florida, it's Missouri. There's so many different states that have these sorts of initiatives also on the ballot. And the good we can do is to vote.
Well, again, this is what makes it so important that we're not doing an ASB president for senior class. I mean, this is so much more serious. But unfortunately, our politics kind of trickle down to, who do I like more? And that is not what we should be looking at. It's where these policies are headed. What's the sober adult thinking that goes behind these things? What are the outcomes that we're going to incur as a culture here in Colorado? I think there's 10 states that have abortion on the ballot. Let me swing it a little at the end of the program here about religious liberty. The Constitution, the First Amendment, promises all Americans the freedom of religion, not the freedom from religion. It's like they changed that little grammatical thing and they think somehow it's illegal to talk about God in the public square. No. You're supposed to protect my right to speak in the public square about my faith. And man, has the culture turned that on its head, as if it's some kind of illegal expression to talk about God. Speak to that general truth that these rights are derived from God, not government, not by any administration, Republican or Democrat, that God himself gives us these rights to have conscience, to express ourselves of faith and no faith. We need to recognize that people of no faith are free to talk about what they want to talk about, but there is no way you have the right to muzzle me in this country, at least not yet. Tim, speak to that issue of religious freedom.
Well, I think this is one of the greatest ironies of American history, and I'm not overstating it, because the First Amendment was specifically drafted to protect and nourish people of faith. That is the whole purpose of the First Amendment, and it's now being weaponized against us. And it seems to me that the biggest issue in this election year that is mostly never discussed is the issue of religious liberty and the rights of conscience. In fact, I would put it in another context. I would say that the issue is conscience and its enemies. And we are now confronting the dogmas of progressive secularism in this election. I would say that the biggest issue facing all of America today is not the economy or the border, as major as those are. I think that the major issue in this election year is a spiritual crisis. It's a spiritual recession of the first order. And I think that we are going to see this, whoever is elected, we are going to see this play out in the very next term of the Supreme Court, because we will know in just a few weeks when the court goes into session, we will know whether it will be taking not one, not two, not three, but up to 4 major religious liberty cases this term. So I think that dealing with the impact of this impact on our religious liberty is really, in many ways, first among equals.
So true. And what a place to land. John, you want to add to that as we close?
Well, just every single one of those cases that Tim mentioned started at the bureaucrat state level. It started with state officials, a lot of times well-meaning, but themselves misunderstanding the First Amendment. And then we, of course, have a cultural narrative which says that freedom of religion is only the right to believe what you want in your own head, in your own home, in your own house of worship. That's not what the founders intended. The founders intended all of that and also the right to order our public lives around our deeply held beliefs, recognizing that that's a right that comes first and foremost, as the Declaration says, from God, not the state.
Yeah. Well, and this is why we're doing the program. I think we hopefully have convinced you at least to get up out of your seat, get registered. It takes like 2 minutes. You can do most of that online, I believe, and then vote. You can do that in early voting. You can do that on the day of the election, November 5th. But I hope those 25 to 35, 40 million people, Christians, that we are convincing you to look at the issues and study that, come from a biblical perspective, and then go and vote. That's what we're urging you to do. We can't tell you how to vote. That's not our place. But we can say, at least as a Christian, think about these things through a biblical framework. So, Tim, John, thank you both for being with me. And man, this is good. I could just keep talking to you all day about these issues. It's very stimulating, but it has its limits. And I want people to realize the hope is in Christ, not Air Force One, as you said, Tim. And we've got to maintain that perspective of our citizenship being of heaven, not of this earth. And we'll be long gone, and people will still be biting and chewing and kicking down here. But someday, and this is where Gene and I have landed, someday, it says in Scripture, every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. So we don't need to worry.
Wow, that is so passionately said, Jim. And I so appreciate the energy and the knowledge that our guests have brought. We've heard from John Stonestreet and from Tim Goeglein, and they both have excellent books. John Stonestreet wrote A Practical Guide to Culture. Tim Goeglein wrote American Restoration. We've got details about those books on our website, and the link is in the program description. And then Focus on the Family has a team of people that are watching over this cultural landscape and looking at things that matter to us as believers. It's called Daily Citizen, and we encourage you to swing by our website and find out more about Daily Citizen in the program notes. On behalf of the entire team, thanks for joining us today for Focus on the Family with Jim Daly. I'm John Fuller, inviting you back as we once again help you and your family thrive in Christ.